Hello everybody, my name is Rolak, and welcome to a new type of video that I've been wanting to do for a while now, called Let's Talks. Basically, I'm going to be talking about the latest game I've played through and essentially do a review about it, considering it's still relatively fresh on my mind. To make things simple, I'm going to divide this video into talking about what I consider to be the 4 core elements to any game, that being gameplay, visuals, controls, and story. Without any further delay, let's get to talking about Outlast II, my horror Let's Play for this year. Outlast 2 follows a fairly simple and familiar gameplay to most horror games, being that you go from point to point, avoiding, hiding, and or running from various threats throughout the game. And like most games, there are no real ways to fight back in any shape or form. And for the most part, it works. It gives you the sense that you really are helpless and can't really do anything to change it. The only ways to fully escape an enemy chasing you or patrolling the area is to hide and wait for them to go away, or run away from them long enough for the game to cut them off and stop them. Now that we've talked about the basic necessity of horror, let's talk about what makes the Outlast games unique, and that's the camera, your main source of light. The camera essentially functions as a flashlight. It has night vision mode, which allows you to see nearly perfectly in the dark, and has a zoom function to help see things further away. A new element was added onto the camera for this game as well, the microphone. When turned on, this allows you to hear things from a far distance or more clearly. It's primarily used to help gauge where enemies are to avoid the patrol routes. The camera isn't perfect, however. As you use night vision, it slowly depletes the battery of the camera. Each battery has an approximately 10 minutes of life, and when it reaches 0, it doesn't automatically force you to reload one. Instead, it simply dims the effectiveness of night vision to nearly useless, making things just slightly brighter than the usual dark. And while the camera is indeed useful, like I said before, it's not perfect. Night vision is nice. It's the only way to actually see anything when it's pitch black. But it also makes a lot of the environment kind of blend together, making some things harder to see. And the zoom function is basically useless, as most things are rather blurry or fuzzy from certain distances and is never quite useful. But the biggest blunder has to be the microphone and how strangely underutilized it is. Yes, it is nice to hear enemies walking about, but the only real downside to that is that it's never really clear on where exactly they are. There's no indicator that really helps to tell their distance, only the volume, and even then it's hard to determine exactly where they are. I can safely say the only times I actually used the microphone was to just hear certain characters better. Camera aside, there's not really anything actually stunning or grand about Outlast 2's gameplay. It's the basic horror game formula, like I've said, and it does it well enough. But I can't help but feel like you're almost too helpless. Yes, for the most part, you're running away from crazed religious people or freaky heretics. But you can't tell me this guy, Blake, don't worry, we'll talk about him later, can't put up anything that closely resembles a fight. I know it would go against the feeling of being helpless, but come on. At least shove them aside or something. Even sneaking around is mundane and rather boring. For a good chunk of the game, you're simply hiding away from enemies so they don't chase you and kill you in 2 to 3 hits. Give me something to throw or anything to distract them. Having the player just sit around behind a wall or in a barrel or in a closet just doesn't make the game interesting. It simply turns it into a waiting game while you guess that the bad guys are hopefully far enough away from you so that they won't chase you. The only decent form of protection are bandages, where you can use them to heal up from being hit by enemies. But even then, it feels weird to even include them in the first place. For one, Blake can't run while applying the bandage, so you can't use it mid-chase, and he puts his camera down to do it, so you can't even see if you're successfully hiding from someone while doing so. You can run whilst reloading your batteries, but that's probably even worse to do so. All in all, Outlast 2 added in some new things that in the end never really did anything to actually improve the gameplay from the first game. Which is odd, because I consider the first game to have enough mechanics. There wasn't really any reason to add anything more. Outlast 2 has a pretty decent visual style for what it's trying to be, which is a semi-realistic, gritty horror game. The characters look like normal people, for the most part. The environments are nice, and the gore factor is certainly there throughout the whole game. My only real gripe is that it feels too gory, and that's the main thing I have a problem with the visuals of Outlast 2. It tries way too hard to be gross, like actually gross, as in almost making me legitimately puke gross. And yeah, it does the job of being visually displeasing to look at due to its horror style, but I had enough of seeing shit buckets, dead children, guts, and an actual fucking birth scene, which apparently was patched to be actually close up and personal later, so that's great to know. Outlast 2 definitely tried to go for more shock appeal this time around, but it just feels way too much at times that I don't want to look at it anymore. As for the environment itself, compared to the first game, it's a big letdown. Outlast had the visual appeal of being an insane asylum. Classic horror setting. Really sells it that the place is hopelessly fucked and there's no sane person within the walls at all. With narrow corridors and dead-end corners everywhere to add the helplessness. Outlast 2, however, kinda ruins what the first game had going on. Instead of an almost claustrophobic, suffocating building, you're wandering around a forest village with so many buildings to explore with various angry people who are not too keen on the whole intruder thing. Outlast 2 feels far more open than the first game, which is weird because there's almost nothing to actually discover if you go off the main path. And being far more open world to explore really doesn't sell the whole horror aspect. Kind of like Security Breach, going from being stuck in a room by yourself to just wandering around in a large open area. It's just not scary at times. The only parts which I considered scary were the school moments and navigating through the mines, which happened near the end of the game, so that's great. Also, for some reason, this game tends to not be too obvious on what you can and can't interact with. For example, the river sequence. There's a moment where you have to cross the river to retrieve your boat to continue on along it. To do so, you have to push down a tree to make a bridge. The only downside is that the game makes it very hard to tell if it's an interactive object or just a piece of the environment. This happens a few times throughout the game where it's distinctly unclear as to whether or not something is interactable. I know there have been moments recently where people have been complaining that devs are adding in obvious markers to tell the player where to go, but I can appreciate that kind of stuff when it gets me going in the right direction when I'm done with the room I'm in, especially if I'm being hunted down by a dude I can't do anything against. Enemies are also just not as interesting this time around. Gone are the manic, malformed, disturbed individuals that hunted you down due to mental illness types of people. Now we've got religious people, lady with a big pickaxe, fat priest dude. Bear in mind, that's for about halfway throughout the game. After that, we actually get some, decent looking enemies, such as the heretics looking like wicker demons, like you see in Trustfar and WoW, or the Loudermitch demon, which chases you in the school segments. But those are both more towards the end of the game and don't really have much impact by that point. Overall, Outlast 2 is a decent looking game with visuals that certainly get the job done of portraying it as a gritty, gory horror game, even if it goes overboard a couple times. In terms of how the game feels to play, there's nothing too spectacular, and that's good. Outlast 2's controls are simple, and that's all it needs to be. There wasn't a moment where I can recall in the game where the controls were unfair or broken. The only slight hiccups I can remember when we were going from prone to standing, you'd have to reapply the sprint, but aside from that, there wasn't much else. The only moment I can call unruly was the boat section. That thing was sluggish and at oftentimes unresponsive, especially when it gets stuck on some rocks. But all in all, Outlast 2 has good enough controls that don't do anything to deter or improve gameplay, and that's good enough for me. Oh boy, here we go. I chose this segment to be the last simply to highlight how just fucking weird and confusing the story is. So let's get the synopsis out of the way first off. You are Blake Langerman, cameraman, assistant, and husband to investigative journalist Lynn. You are flying to a town known as Temple Gate, where you are trying to investigate a seemingly impossible murder of a pregnant woman. Along the way, the helicopter crashes, and Blake is left alone to find Lynn and escape. Along the way, Blake finds that Temple Gate is full of religious nutjobs known as the Testament of the New Ezekiel, led by a priest known as Father Noth, who kidnap Lynn and find that the Antichrist in her womb, despite not being pregnant. Blake and Lynn escape the townsfolk only to be deterred by heretics, a group of people who separated from the church and are being led by an individual known as Val, who then kidnap Lynn and take her far away into the mines. Throughout the rest of the game, Blake tries everything to find Lynn and get out of Temple Gate, while being deterred by Marta, the enforcer of the church, infectious disease townsfolk, a little dude shooting arrows atop a big dude, heretics, and Val, as well as his own past. Yes, throughout the game, Blake suffers from flashbacks that takes him back to the 4th grade, where he is haunted by being unable to help his old crush Jessica from being molested and then murdered by a priest known as Loudermilch. Eventually, Blake finds Lynn, who is like 9 months pregnant or something. They run through a thunderstorm while everything is fucked. Marta dies, Lynn gives birth, dies as well, Noth kills himself, and that leaves Blake to wander about the dead village with his baby until light engulfs them both. So to recap, this story doesn't work for various reasons. I'm going to get the main downside out of the way. This story doesn't know what it wants to do. There is no clear indicative anything about what we're trying to do. The only main thing that the main focus is Blake needs to find Lynn. That is it. That is the main thing. But the fact that the game keeps fucking deterring you here and there and everywhere, it's so fucking confusing at times. The worst is when it's trying to push this narrative that Blake is haunted by his past of being, unable to help his friend who was molested and pushed down a fucking flight of stairs by a douchebag priest. But here's the thing, I don't care about that. I know it sounds a little harsh, but I simply do not care. At any point throughout the story, every time we went into the school flashback nonsense, I sighed with, this shit again. Because I just didn't care about it. I wanted to play the main game, saving my wife from psychopaths in a fucking village in the middle of Arizona. Not whatever the hell this is. I don't care about that. It deters so much from the main game that I honestly forgot that we were doing anything. And there are just so many things that are just left unexplained up towards the end. It's so frustrating. There was no clear indicative of what actually was going on. But here's the thing, technically nothing happened. So the whole deal with Lynn being pregnant and giving birth to the Antichrist, yeah, that was all just a hallucination. The big flashing lights that sound like the fucking Inception noises, those are apparently radio towers from the Murkoff Corporation in a remote settlement in Arizona, later named Templegate. I'm just reading off the wiki at this point. With the intent of creating an isolated environment for testing mind control experiments on the unsuspecting village population using powerful electromagnetic radio frequencies. The radio towers would later be destroyed by a rampaging... Well, we don't care about that. So the recap, a lot of the shit that was happening didn't happen. The kid is not real. None of what Blake was experiencing in the school was real. Half of the shit that was going on in this game was just nothing. It was fake. The baby does not exist because it's not there. Lynn died from something. I don't know what, but she died. To make this make even more sense, there is a comic epilogue. There were a bunch of Outlast comics that were released around the time of Outlast II, and a bit, I would assume, after around Outlast Whistleblower was released. There is an epilogue about Outlast 2, not in the game, but outside of the game in a comic format. Apparently, I'm just going to read this straight off the wiki again. Murkoff workers in hazmat suits are pulling the dead bodies from all over Templegate, and they have found Blake Langerman alive, but catatonic, without a baby, proving that he hallucinated it. Then what was the fucking point of the entire game? I just don't care about anything that happens throughout this entire story, because none of it is interesting, and it doesn't help that Blake... Oh, Blake... I am not sugarcoating it when I'm saying that Blake Langerman is possibly one of the worst protagonists I have ever played as. There was not a single point in the game where I felt bad for anything he was doing. He's so fucking pathetic. He whines about everything. You can't tell the fucking difference from his wife or his fucking 4th grade crush. None of the shit that he's saying is making sense half the time. And I just don't care about half the shit that's going on. Yes, he's haunted by the fact that he failed to save his friend. However, why should I care? That is not happening in the now with the main story of Outlast 2. I don't want to know about that stuff, because that is taking me away from the current happenings of the game. If you're going to explain the past, do it in it would, honestly, being perfectly honest, Blake's past, the whole, flashbacks and everything, would have been a perfect opportunity to make it a side story similar to what Whistleblower was for the first game. But we don't get that. We get these stupid flashback segments mixed in with actual gameplay that are also very vague and not really clear on what the hell is going on up until the last one, where it's revealed that Jessica, Blake's crush from that time period, was selected by a pervert priest, surprise, surprise, called Loudermilch. Takes her, molests her or some shit, and then runs away, and then pushes her down a set of stairs, and that leads into Loudermilch blackmailing Blake into convincing everybody that Jessica committed suicide, and then Blake is then forever haunted by the fact that he couldn't do anything to stop it, even though he had the fucking perfect ability to do so. It is at no point where I feel any remorse for Blake in any way whatsoever. He whines about it. I've already said this, but I'm just going to say it again. He whines, he bitches about everything. There is no redeeming qualities about this character. I feel terrible playing as him. To put in perspective, the last two protagonists, being Miles and Wayland, they didn't talk. They didn't have a backstory. Miles was an investigative reporter, much like Lynn, and Wayland was just a dude who he was a whistleblower. That's what he was. They didn't talk. They didn't have backstories, and that's what I care about. The fact that I'm being put into the body of this weird dude that has no idea what the fuck is going on half the times really takes me away from enjoying the horror game. For the most part, when horror games give you a silent protagonist, it's a good way to basically insert yourself into the character so that you feel like you are the character going through this horror ordeal, or whatever you want to call it. And that was the case with what Outlast 1 was, and Whistleblower was as well, because I felt more immersed in it, not having to listen to this dumbass talk about shit every 2 seconds. Blake is just, again, there's nothing redeeming about him. I hated playing him at every given moment. And I want to go back to the story because it's just, I'm trying so hard to find anything good about the story, but there's just nothing. Nothing throughout the entirety of the story makes sense. Nothing interesting happens. There is no, anything. In the first game, there was a ghost thing called the Wall Rider that was wreaking havoc in the asylum. There's nothing happening in Temple Gate. There's nothing. They're all hallucinogenic nonsense. There was no real threat. The story was nothing. That's all I can really describe it as. Just absolutely nothing. To put it to words to end off this segment, Outlast 2 tries to have a deeper story. Outlast 2 tries to have a decent story, but is plagued constantly by taking the player out of that story to give context to the main protagonist's history. To try and, sympathize with him or something. But the fact that we keep getting taken out of the game to experience these past happenings doesn't sell me on wanting to play the game. You're like, I don't care about what he's doing at this point. This adds nothing to the game. It tries too hard to be interesting or deep or whatever you want to call it. In the end, it just doesn't work. I was not pulled into the story as I was for Outlast 1 or Whistleblower because nothing made sense. You have to have a story that makes decent enough sense for me to actually, get invested into it. But with the fact that the comics confirmed that nothing really bad actually happened, it's just insanely disappointing. All of the entirety of the game, looking for Lynn, getting the baby, it's nothing. Like Lynn said, there's nothing there. That's all I can really say about the story, is that there's nothing there. At the end of the day, Outlast 2 is not a bad game by any means. But compared to the first game, it just doesn't improve much in any way whatsoever. The environment is bland, the creeps are boring, the story makes little to no sense, and Blake is genuinely one of the worst protagonists in any horror game. This game feels like it's just trying to be the first game, but better, so they did so by making things more gross, more mysterious and deep, and yeah, that can work to some extent, but it really falls apart after you start looking at all the faults. All in all, Outlast 2 does a good job of being a decent enough horror game to get you scared from time to time. Just don't try to read too much into much else. That's pretty much all I got to say about this game. All in all, it was alright. Certainly not as good as the first game. At best, I would give it probably like a 6 out of 10, maybe. I'm probably being a bit too generous with that, but it's not a bad game by any means whatsoever. Just don't expect anything spectacular. Yeah, so thank you all for watching and hearing this review slash retrospective slash whatever the hell I'm going to call it. I'm going to see if I can sneak in one more Let's Play before the year ends, but don't count on that. I'm great with this. But until next time, my name is Rolak, and I hope you all have a good day.